You know the story. The year was 1620. A small vessel sets out from the harbour at Plymouth, headed across the Atlantic to the New World. It carries on board a small company of people, men and women, who are leaving the old world so that in a new world they can worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. They are pilgrims going forth to find liberty. Or maybe the story you know is that in 1620 a group of religious fanatics who had been chased from their own country because of their views crossed the Atlantic. They landed in a territory controlled by friendly, welcoming Native American tribes. Yet they stole the Native Americans' food. They stole their land. And before they knew what was happening, the Native Americans found the white men were stealing everything from them. They tried to rebel. They tried to drive them out. It was too late. There was a war. And thousands, tens of thousands, millions even of Indians end up dead because of it. It was a year of triumph. It was a year of tragedy. It was a memorable year. It was a year that is best forgotten. If you haven't guessed already, I'm talking about the Pilgrim Fathers and the voyage of the Mayflower in 1620. I'm Pastor Charmley. Welcome to Bethel Evangelical Free Church, Hanley on YouTube. And in this video I want to talk about 4 new books on the Pilgrim Fathers and to give some of my thoughts as to why both of those narratives, although both of them are based on reality, are overly simplistic. The 400th anniversary of the Mayflower is a very different business from the 300th. In 1920, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was a dominant Christian culture. On both sides of the Atlantic, the Pilgrim Fathers were celebrated as champions of freedom and liberty. They were championed as the pioneers, or among the pioneers of a new nation. Unlike previous colonists sent across the Atlantic, they were not sent by the government. They were not establishing little outposts of Elizabethan England. They were not convicts either. They were not criminals who were being got rid of, who had left their country, to quote a later writer speaking about Australia, who left their country for their country's good. They were people who left their country because their country wouldn't have them and wouldn't grant them liberty. That was the narrative in 1920. Plymouth Rock, Thanksgiving, Congregationalism. 100 years later, the world has changed completely. The congregational churches are much smaller and weaker than they once were. In England and in the United States, the majority of them have entered larger church unions, with the resulting many have closed. Now, the church I pastor, Bethel Evangelical Free Church, we are in the congregational tradition. So I put that out there just as a statement that I am more in agreement with the Pilgrim Fathers. But 100 years ago, things were simple and straightforward. Today, here we are. One of the things that complicates matters is the coronavirus pandemic, but here we are in the middle of cancel culture. Here we are, we've had a slave trader statue thrown in the dock at Bristol. They're talking about getting rid of George Whitfield's statue at Penn State. Jonathan Edwards is persona non grata because of his having owned slaves. So, what about the Pilgrims? Well, from the perspective of cancel culture, the Pilgrims are an embarrassment. Now, they are there to be cancelled for cancel culture because the Pilgrims were white Europeans who went over and settled land in America, where the Native Americans were. Also, they were Christians, and some of them even committed that cardinal sin in the eyes of cancel culture of trying to convert the Indians to Christianity. Now, we shouldn't forget that it is complicated. From a Native American standpoint, the Pilgrims are very, very complicated. But we also mustn't confuse the Pilgrims and the generations that followed. It's over a generation later that we have what's called King Philip's War. But what about the Pilgrims? What about these 4 books? Well, the first one to talk about is this one, which is Stephen Tompkins' The Journey to the Mayflower, God's Outlaws and the Invention of Freedom. As the title suggests, this is not primarily a book about the Mayflower crossing, and it's certainly not a book about what happened in America. It's a book about what happened first. Who were these pilgrims? What were they doing? Why did they cross the Atlantic? And this is really a history of Elizabethan separatism and what it became later on in the 17th century. The separatists were those who believed, as Brown, the founding separatist, puts it, in reformation without tarrying for any. They were frustrated, many people were frustrated by Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth I, she was a great queen, one of the greatest we've had. Not that we've had an awful lot, but she was one of our great monarchs. Elizabeth, however, was deeply conservative in her religious beliefs. Her attitude was that the church should be just as it was when her younger brother Edward VI died. Now, the Puritans believed that the Reformation in England hadn't been finished yet. It needed to be completed. And the only way to complete the Reformation in England was to make the church look more like the Scottish and continental Reformed churches, to be more Presbyterian. Now, Elizabeth, of course, refused. And as long as you believed in a state church, which most people in the 16th century did believe in, that was that. But the separatists were those who said, no, if it's right for the church to be further reformed, then we need to do it without waiting, without tarrying for the Queen of the Magistrates. And this is the story of that movement, of martyrs like Barrow and Greenwood, of awkward men and women like the Pilgrim Fathers, who the country had trouble letting them leave, but at the same time many in the country wanted them to leave. It's a story of noblemen and commoners, a story of gentry and ordinary women, a story of merchants, a story of adventurers. It's a story of the road, the journey to the Mayflower. Excellently told. If you want to know what Elizabethan separatism is like, this is probably the most popular level treatment. And it's not a simple book, but it is an excellent treatment that is, well, I say popular, but it's more mid-level. It's not something that's, it's a fairly nice hardcover, but it's something that you can get your teeth into. It's extremely readable. Another book that deals with the way to the Mayflower, but also the settlement in America, is Making Haste from Babylon, The Mayflower Pilgrims and Their World, A New History, by Nick Bunker. Nick Bunker is an excellent writer. He's not writing as a decided Christian, but he's writing as somebody who's very sympathetic to the Mayflower Pilgrims and certainly understands the realities of the role religion plays in people's lives. It's important, it's part of identity. And here in this book he deals with the economic realities as well as the social and religious ones. the Pilgrims sailing. Why did they sail? Again, it's not a book. It's not a popular level book. I mean, look how big it is. But it is a well-written and readable book, and it delves into that mercantile reality. London was one of the great merchant cities. England's fleets, merchant fleets, were of vital importance. One of the great reasons why the Pilgrims were allowed to settle in America was mercantile. It's also, of course, where they got the money from, because anything like that costs money. They had to hire a ship. They had to buy supplies. Well, here is another. This is Derek Wilson, The Mayflower Pilgrims, sifting fact from fable. Published by SBCK, and it's in many ways a simpler book than the others, and it deals with what's the background of the Pilgrims, what's the truth about them, and it's an attractive truth. It's, the idea that these were sour-faced religious fanatics is nonsense. They were complicated human beings. And they were human beings who, like most human beings in that period, religion was absolutely central to their identity. For most people today in the West, it's not. It's a sort of add-on thing, and so people have say, well, why is it that you do things because of your religion, because of your beliefs? Well, because these things are not add-ons. These things are part of our identity. And finally, and perhaps the most complex, again it's a big book, it's published by Yale Academic Press, which tells you it's an academic book. It's John G. Turner, They Knew They Were Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty. Now, my previous encounter with John Turner was a very different book that he wrote a few years ago, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet. So here's a man who has studied American religion from various perspectives. This was published in 2012 by Harvard. But this is a very different book from the Brigham Young book. It's a book about separatists and pilgrims. And he does go into the background. He speaks of where they came from. But his concentration in this book is what happened not only on the voyage, but particularly after the voyage, what happens in the New World. In this sense, this book complements these others. These others go over the same ground to a certain extent. This complements them. It details how it was that what started off as a good relationship between the Native Americans and the Indians went horribly wrong. He writes, Americans learn about the Pilgrims when they are children. In elementary schools across the country, late November has been a time for pilgrim hats and Indian headdresses. Along the way, Americans absorb elements of the Pilgrim myth, a ship, a compact, a rock, a winter of death and disease, a harvest, and a Thanksgiving turkey meal. It is a heart-warming story about two people feasting together instead of fighting each other. There is also an alternative, more dispiriting history, a story of betrayal and theft. The Pilgrims made a treaty with the Indian, an alliance with the Indians, then took their land and killed or enslaved those who remained. Those native communities that survived found themselves reduced to small, impoverished enclaves. In this line of thought, the ongoing American adulation of the Mayflower passengers is offensive. Late November is a time for mourning, not a time for giving thanks. They Knew They Were Pilgrims includes aspects of the above stories, but also introduces other narratives. He's trying to be fair and to take both the pro-pilgrim myth and the anti-pilgrim myth and produce instead a balanced and meaningful narrative. And I think he does it very well. So, John G. Turner, They Knew They Were Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony and the Contest for American Liberty. Now, one thing I need to say before I finish this video is that we need to understand what liberty meant in the 17th century is not what liberty means to many today. Religious liberty in the 17th century for most people did not mean that everyone had, in a country, in a territory, had the liberty to worship according to their own conscience. What it meant was that you had the liberty to worship in the right way. So in this manner of thinking, in England you had a liberty to be Church of England. In Holland you had a liberty to be Dutch Reformed. There were certain liberties allowed to foreigners in other countries who could worship as they pleased as foreigners. After all, if they're speaking another language, they're not going to be drawing away locals. But what the Pilgrims wanted was to have the liberty to worship as separatists. And that they could only get by travelling across the Atlantic to the New World and founding their own country, where liberty was to worship as they saw right, rather than to worship according to some other authority. So we have to remember that when it comes to liberty in the 17th century. It's only really through the 17th century struggles, the 18th century, and then into the 19th century that liberty becomes defined otherwise. And of course in 1688, when you have the beginnings of quote-unquote religious liberty in Britain, it's toleration. It's not until the 19th century when we go from toleration, from legal toleration to legal liberty. So 4 books on the Pilgrim Fathers. John Turner, They Knew They Were Pilgrims. Derek Wilson, The Mayflower Pilgrims. Stephen Tompkins, The Journey to the Mayflower. Nick Bunker, Making Haste from Babylon. All good books, all well worth reading. May God help us to enjoy these things, and by reading good history, to appreciate the realities that this world is more complicated than we sometimes imagine. And may we, by this reading of history, develop a humility that looks at the world and sees that we are not the last word, and we stand on the shoulders of giants. And may God bless you and help you in your life for Him.